Welcome, everyone. This is another edition of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research Think and Drink series. We hope everybody's healthy as possible in these days and times. My name is Frederick Douglass Dixon. Yes, I said it correctly, Frederick Douglass Dixon. Only Dixon on payday. But today's conversation will touch upon a great issue, and the name of the conversation is Billionaire Wilderness, the Future of Wealth in the West. In just a moment, I'll introduce my speaker. Got a host to take care of. If you want to see all the speakers, make sure that you press gallery view. If you want to see only the current speaker, then you can press speaker view. You can type all comments and questions into the chat and we will be able to see them. You may also type questions into the Q&A box for only the speakers to see them. This summer, we will host these events every other week, and we look for, in 2 weeks, to have a very special Think and Drink, which is the introduction of the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Center Institute. So we're up and running for fall, and next week's Think and Drink title will be The History and Realities of Protest in America. It will feature Dr. Leslie McLemore, President Emeritus of Jackson State University, Dr. Sunyata Chachua, University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and Dr. David Stovall, University of Illinois, Chicago. Should be very interesting. We hope that you can join us. If you want to keep in touch with us, make sure you can contact us at humanities@uwyo.edu, and make sure that you can check us out on our web channel, our YouTube channel and it's for go to YouTube and search for Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. Okay, tonight will be a great night. Our moderator is the great Scott Hinkle from the Wyoming Humanities Institute of Research.
Thank you. Indeed, I'm Scott Hinkle, and it is my great joy tonight to have a conversation with Dr. Justin Farrell. Dr. Justin Farrell is a professor and author at Yale University and a proud first-generation college student from Wyoming. His research tackles questions of environment, politics, human culture, and policy using a mixture of methods, blending ethnographic fieldwork with large-scale computational techniques from network science and machine learning. His books and articles have won national awards and were used in his recent testimony before the US Senate Special Committee on the Climate Crisis. Justin teaches classes on the American West, public lands, and research methods. Tonight we'll be talking about Justin's book, Billionaire Wilderness, the Ultra-Wealthy and the Remaking of the American West. A truly wonderful book. The book takes you inside the exclusive world of the ultra-wealthy, showing how today's richest people are using the natural environment to solve the existential dilemmas they face. Justin spent 5 years in Teton County, Wyoming, the richest county in the United States, and a community where income inequality is the worst in the nation. He conducted hundreds of in-depth interviews, gaining unprecedented access to tech CEOs, Wall Street financiers, oil magnates, and other prominent figures in business and politics. He also talked with the rural poor who live among the ultra-wealthy and often work for them. The result is a penetrating account of the far-reaching consequences of the massive accrual of wealth and an eye-opening and sometimes troubling portrait of changing American West, where romanticizing rural poverty and conserving nature can be lucrative socially as well as financially. Welcome, Justin.
Hey, it's great to be here, Scott. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be able to have a beer and chat about the book. I've never been able to do that.
Cheers.
So cheers.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about your research generally, how you came to Billionaire Wilderness, and things about the book that I wasn't able to in my little intro there.
Yeah, definitely. So most of my work looks at the North American West, really focused on the Intermountain West. And as you mentioned, was born in Wyoming, in Cheyenne, actually, so just down the road from you all, and up the road from where I'm at right now in Denver. And just those personal experiences, having family, you know, in the state, and then I also have family. My mom's side is in Idaho, and I have all these just kind of questions that are bubbling to the surface as I get older, as I was growing up. I also lived for a time in Nebraska, and so I approach my research through that lens. And a lot of folks who do, you know, social scientific research are after questions and answering questions that are, you know, about themselves or about their experience and what they've seen, puzzles that kind of emerge, things that don't make sense. Or for me, you know, that really played into this book for sure. And it's my second book, but is really the book that I've wanted to write for a long time. And so just in general, though, most of my work focuses on the West. For example, aside from this book, I have a survey right now that we're fielding in the rural West on COVID, and just looking at how people are impacted and their, you know, attitudes about federal aid and all sorts of things like that are not as kind of eye-popping as the title of this book. But so I'm doing a lot of different things around the West, and most of my work focuses on Wyoming. But so in terms of Billionaire Wilderness, I really, you know, after I finished my first book, which also took place up in the greater Yellowstone area, I encountered just the impact of wealth, you know, over and over again, in addition to kind of growing up, going out in that area and seeing how places like Jackson were growing and changing, seeing places like Bozeman, Big Sky, all around the park really, and how that was so very different than other parts of the state, obviously, and other parts of the West. And, you know, even just little snarky comments like my grandpa or my parents would make about Jackson, or it just kind of got me thinking about, you know, how the West is changing and how we can see a place like Jackson or Teton County, how the amount of wealth there, and we can talk all about that. You know, is that happening in other places? And we can see it really clearly in Jackson. And so that's why I kind of narrowed in on that case. The other thing I would say too is just, as an academic researcher, there are some significant gaps in our understanding about wealth, about the rise of income inequality in the US. And so that was kind of the other half of it. And that we have a lot of studies, at least in the academic literature and economics, sociology, political science, about the, you know, erasure of the middle class, the concentration of wealth. And we've all seen those in headlines, and there's a lot of really good academic research on those topics. But one thing that I really felt was missing in that, and across all those fields really, was an in-depth, what we call qualitative research. So based on interviews, based on being somewhere and knowing what it's like to live there, knowing what it's like to inhabit a certain social class in Jackson, whether that's, you know, at the top or the bottom, and or even in the middle. And so I was aiming to kind of fill that research gap as well, in terms of really putting some meat on the bones, you could say, of these top level economic analyses that we know and that we have from, you know, Piketty and all these other folks who are writing about the topic. And so that was kind of how I set out on that. And Jackson and Teton County was just the perfect place to do that.
Yeah, that's great. Everyone should read the Piketty book, right?
I mean, there you go.
Like, it's just like amazing. And like for people who wish to like learn systematically, methodologically about wealth and the world, it's an excellent.
The other thing I would say too is that, you know, we can get into this, I think, more, but that people's perceptions of the ultra wealthy are often based on half truths, I would say, or exaggerations, or maybe exposés, and so we also needed something that I felt could be trusted more, and that had more analytical rigor than maybe, you know, a newspaper article about this rich person doing this or that, or about, you know, Kanye lives in Cody and what's in the sort of like, okay, you know, and forming our opinions based on those stories, which, you know, they can be helpful, but I think they miss out on a lot too.
Yeah. Oh God, yes. Can we talk about that a little bit? I mean, this is, I mean, one of the things that I admire very much about your book is the methodology behind it, because you're absolutely right. Conversations about wealth and inequality and redistribution, they're hot button issues, and people, even academics, can sometimes go to stereotype quickly. But you, in your book, you had this methodology that I admire. You let the ultra wealthy speak for themselves.
Yeah, that was my goal. And, I imagine it's not perfect, and I'm sure I have blind spots, but that was the most important thing for me setting out on this to do this project, was to do something where we hear from folks and from their experience and in their own words. And then, because we just live in this soundbite world. We live in a world that's resistant to complexity. We live, in a world where, and I do it, where we're hasty to and we're quick to either brand people as really good or really bad, and just kind of be done with it and say, okay, all rich people are bad, makes me feel better about myself, and that I'm going to move on or something like that. But and that's maybe part of human nature and how we sort of operate. I don't know, we could debate that, but I was just, again, more interested in a careful analysis, but as an academic researcher. And that doesn't mean that I'm 100% objective. I think that is impossible, but I did my best to be accurate, and then at the same time not shy away from, as an observer and as someone who's done this work, to assess it and to critique or state what I think is really going on, and to offer that up. And so but in doing so, I really tried, I wasn't out to get these folks. That's not interesting to me, but I also wasn't shying away from some of what we would probably think are uglier realities, so, but I will say, I write a lot in there, and I've been critiqued for it, that I constantly say that, I'm trying, that we shouldn't become bitter at certain wealthy individuals and their moral failings, or being appalled at how much their clothes cost or whatever, or focus on. But I'm more interested in these political and policy solutions, to alleviate these problems, rather than just saying these people are rude or out of touch monsters.
Had you made a move like that, it would have been easy to dismiss your book. It would have been easy for someone to say he's like trafficking in petty stereotypes, and therefore we don't have to pay attention to this book whatsoever.
Yeah,
right?
I think so. And I would dismiss a book like that too, in terms of relying on it maybe to make decisions. Maybe it could be an interesting read or something, but it wouldn't be the type of work that I think stands the test of time and that serves the public interest. Again, though, I'm at times very critical when I need to be, but so there is that, I basically can't please everyone on either side.
Sure. But the best we can do is gather good, high quality information that's testable, as you said, to make the best decisions about the world in which we live.
Totally, and to be open to conversations like this, to be open to critique, to be open to someone coming along and doing a similar study and maybe finding something different, hopefully not too different, because I hope I wasn't way off, but to replicate it, and to kind of keep the conversation going in venues like this, and locally, in Teton County, and a lot of the other talks that I've given, mostly online since the book's come out, but with all different types of audiences.
Yeah. Maybe one more question. I don't know. This is maybe just something that interests me. I don't know if it interests anybody else. But one more question on your credibility, your way of making arguments. I've lived in Wyoming for 5 years or so. This is the start of my 6th academic year teaching at the University of Wyoming. And unlike anywhere else that I've lived, right? I mean, I find Wyoming's politics fascinating, right? Someone can say you know, I'm a 18th generation Wyomingite or whatever it is that they say.
I don't think that exists.
5th generation Wyomingite.
That barely
Whatever,
exists.
right?
Yeah,
I've been here forever, and therefore, like anything that comes out of their mouth next automatically has credibility in a way that, like, I could live here for the rest of my life, and I could never have that credibility, right? It's just curious, you know. But you, like, so you're native Wyomingite, and therefore, anything you say on any topic has an automatic credibility. So good job.
Yeah, I'm actually endlessly fascinated with that point. And you know, I was talking to my neighbor here in Denver the other day, and he works in the oil and gas industry, and he does basically all his work in Wyoming, and he's worked there for a really long time. He's very well connected, and he's just like, I work in oil and gas, and like that should give me some credibility, but they just don't believe anything I say. But you're like a Yale professor.
Yeah.
You don't even live in Wyoming or technically work in Wyoming, other than my research, I guess. But and they'll listen to you, and I kind of I don't know. It's really interesting to me, and it's almost like I think that's true of the Intermountain West, especially, but definitely more so in Wyoming. And it's maybe this like suspicion of outsiders or drawing boundaries around, you know, who counts and whose voice should be heard, and this sort of like in-group and out-group dynamics. But I also think it has to do with this sort of mythical authenticity as well. And which is odd. These boundaries that you draw around is odd for such a state that is so young. You know, I can think about that. Some of my colleagues at Yale, many people, you know, are from the Northeast, and especially in New England, where you do have these generations of people and of families and this. But Wyoming is a pretty young state. Not to mention it was built somewhat recently, just built on the railroad, and there's all these, you know, itinerant people coming in and out, and cattle ranchers and railroad workers, and so it doesn't, for me, match up with its history in terms of the depth of the tradition, and I definitely see that when I talk to people, that people do listen more, and that's quite a shame, because there's so many smart, committed people who care deeply and work tirelessly on behalf of the state and on, like you all, and they're obviously, they shouldn't be devalued because they weren't born there. That just makes sense, but it shouldn't be the case. But again, I think too, yeah, and
on behalf of all of us who are short timers,
right? And you even see that in Teton County, which isn't technically Wyoming, right?
Yes.
And so it's even there. And but what's interesting to me relative to the book, I knew about that point that you just raised, and I knew it very well, and I was able to use it to my advantage in terms of like getting interviews and talking with people, because I knew that this desire for authenticity was strong in the state, but especially from people who had bought whole cloth into these myths of the West and what a real Wyomingite is and all that. And I sort of represented that for them if they had just moved, or they kind of vacationed there and they want that Western experience, which is, you know, does not align with reality in terms of the West. And it's always been a very diverse place, obviously Native peoples, Black folks, all Hispanic. I mean, it's such a melting pot. And so there's, I think, also a darker side to some of that, you know, were you born here type talk that we also, I think, need to maybe address, you know, more critically. Instead of just, I laugh about it a lot, but, you know, we also, I think it's a serious topic too.
I also laugh about it and think it's a serious topic.
Yeah.
Especially since, like, I don't know what the numbers would be or the percentages if you have them, but many of the people you interview are themselves short timers in my language, right? They have recently moved to Wyoming. They have not been here for generations, and they've moved here for specific purposes, right? I mean, you write that, number one, many of them are new-ish to the region. And, you know, back to the Piketty book for a moment, you found that many of them have made their wealth in one particular industry. Many of them have made their wealth in finance, which is maybe a new, I mean, maybe not a new, but an element of our global and national and state economy that, you know, if there's a handful of things going on the planet's surface at the moment, one of those things to pay attention to is the rise of finance capital.
100%. And that's where this book, you know, it's about Teton County, but when I talk with folks outside Teton County, we're talking about this. We're talking about how it connects to these larger global socioeconomic forces, right. And it's especially strong here in the US, that I argue make possible a place like Teton County. And you're right, you do look at the population growth in a place like that, in Teton County, and then across the pass over in Idaho, and those are linked in terms of their population growth, but it's very recent. Since about the 1970s, 80s, especially the 90s and 2000s, the wealth floods this area, and it is coming from finance. And so just to kind of give you a figure, I have graphs in the book where you're sort of tracking how much of the income in Teton County comes from just finance, not a normal job where somebody has a salary or wages, right. Just returns on investments, and investments, you know, in all sorts of things around the world, nothing to do per se with Teton County. And by 2015, 80% of all money made in Teton County came from interest and dividends, and which is just shocking. And I think in 1970, it was like 52 million came from investments, which is a decent amount of money in 1970, but by 2015, that was 3.4 billion. And so there's a massive amount of money, more than anyone I think realizes. And yeah, it has one particular source. But you know, it's advertised, the state's advertised as, you know, Bloomberg Magazine's most wealth-friendliest states. Like, move here. There's no corporate tax. There's no individual income tax. And so it's also been this pull factor too, in terms of advertising it and selling it as that, right? And so, and the income figures are pretty staggering. It's the highest per capita income, has the highest per capita income in the nation. And the 1%, off the top of my head, I think it's like $28 million they make annually. That's annually. And so, you know, it's quite astounding. The numbers really speak for themselves, and there's not, in the book, there's not much. I interviewed some folks from the middle class, and definitely a story, but when you look at the numbers, it's just a very strong top. Wealth is concentrated, and then at the bottom too.
Yeah, you talk about a barbell.
Yeah, I got that term actually from one of my interviewees who was a financier. And that's how it was, this weird sort of, you know, he kept calling it a barbell community, and I thought that was really a nice way to describe it, but it was described almost like in these technocratic terms, stripping, you know, the actual experience of what that's like. So, which was interesting to me, the way that is described. But by the numbers, it's certainly a barbell community. I would say there is also, though, a very strong middle class and a very strong sort of group of folks who care deeply about the community, who are sort of in that middle class, but there's just not very many of them, especially, you know, anymore, or especially compared to how much wealth they command.
I'll break for a second. Someone types, is it time for questions? I mean, it's always time for questions. At any point, you can, our attendees can type a question into the chat, and all of us will be able to see it. Or you can type a question into the Q&A, and only Justin and I will be able to see it. So maybe while people are thinking and typing questions, I'll ask maybe one or two more.
Sure.
I find it totally fascinating that in the book you use the word democracy twice, on page 16 and page 288, and you use the word plutocracy 4 times, on page 121, 122, 146, 261, and just like the number of times you use a word doesn't necessarily, you know, say anything. But I'm just curious, like, why do you use those words? Do you think that those words are accurate to describe the situation that you found? And I guess maybe a good place to start would be like, how do you understand those words, democracy and plutocracy?
Yeah, so plutocracy, I just understand it basically as a society that is governed by the wealthy. So there's an elite class who are defined by their wealth, who control politics, control the political system. And, you know, that may sound familiar or look familiar, as opposed to a system, you know, a democratic system where theoretically everyone has power and it's not a pay-to-play system. Power is, again, theoretically spread evenly, and your vote counts, and it doesn't matter how much money you have. And that, even saying that, when I say that, it sounds so absurd these days, but that's theoretically what we're supposed to have here, right? Yeah. For me, in Teton County, what was interesting was there's this sense that it's the most philanthropic community, that people really, the wealthy folks really care about the community. They give money, they're engaged, and that's true in a lot of ways. But I dug a little deeper into, you know, philanthropy as a tool for plutocracy. So essentially this idea that, okay, this might be the wealthiest county in the nation. Okay, we'll take that because the numbers show that. But that doesn't mean the wealthy folks aren't generously taking care of the community. So it's a sense, maybe plutocracy can work here. Maybe it doesn't have to be all that bad as long as the wealthy are being generous. And so I did a lot of digging into the numbers about where money is going, where social influence is going, people volunteering, and really found that money is, if we want a functioning community, which is kind of the premise of what everybody wants, this, especially this kind of like old time community that they talk about and that they romanticize, the money is really not going to the organizations who really need it to make it a functioning community, right? And to really achieve the type of community that the ultra wealthy romanticize and think exists there. And, you know, small town character, it's got these boardwalks, it's this really cute downtown, everyone gets along, we all look out for one another. Well, if that were true, the numbers would really look a lot different, you know, and they mostly give to non-controversial local issues, and a lot of those were either environment or arts, and rather than to other issues that I found were, as I label them, buzzkill issues. So maybe poverty, education, homelessness, and the numbers just don't add up. With that said, there were many cases where maybe I talked to somebody who paid for college for a student at the high school, you know, and that's a really generous thing, and that's great. And there's a lot of really good philanthropy going on there. But in terms of the type of community that is a functioning and healthy community, I think that there's really a mismatch there, and I really point that out in a couple of the chapters.
On page 121, you ask whether plutocracy is getting the credit it deserves.
Yeah, and somewhat rhetorically, you know, and every time I would bring up philanthropy, it was just a light would go on. And it would say, yeah, it's very, I was just at this, you know, picnic and we raised all this money, or I'm donated some time, or I'm on the board of this organization and that organization. But for example, there's a lot of organizations in the community that are doing really great work to address some of the problems in the community that are just flatlined in terms of their budgets. And in terms of what people wanted to talk about when I would raise the issues, they would talk about saving the moose, or they would talk about the stream quality, the quality of the stream behind their home, or issues that, you know, I wouldn't say are bad, or it's like, you know, we should care about these things. Certainly, I care about moose and environment and land conservation. But again, it was this mismatch between a healthy community and what they wanted as a healthy community. And then also I interviewed 50 of the working poor, and you know, they would just kind of lament that you know, the wealthy are not evil people, but I wish they would care more about some of our problems and not just the moose.
Totally.
And then, you know, obviously there's a lot of other sort of ironies and maybe you could call it hypocrisies relative to flying in on a private jet and then worrying about, conserving land in this particular area of the country when your emissions are causing global climate change, or you worked in an industry like oil and gas industry or something that's contributing to that, and so there's all these other ironies going on too.
So we have many questions. Maybe what I will do is I will ask one last question, and then I will glance through, and I'll probably just read the questions from the audience in order, but there's 2 boxes. So, back from what you just said, right? Stereotypes, they're interesting to study, but when we're thinking about policy, ultimately data matters, right? It's not necessarily that one person is mean or evil or one person is nice and benevolent, right? The question is, what sort of structures do we want? I mean, what does a just community look like? What does a fair community look like? I mean, what is an economy that works for everyone rather than just a select few? I mean, what do those things look like? I mean, another way to answer this question is like, if you are, whether you're ultra wealthy or whether you're a citizen of Wyoming or whether you've been here for 5 minutes or 5 generations, what does fairness look like? What is a good-hearted person who cares about the quality of democracy? What sort of policies would they want to see put into place? Because this situation, I mean, this is a think and drink, and we're 35 minutes into it, and I'm 2/3 of the way through my beer, so maybe I'll just say it plainly. This is not a sustainable situation.
Well, it depends who you're talking about, for who,
Sure. Well, inequality historically has led to much social unrest, and it's no surprise to see lots of social unrest where there's economic inequality.
Yeah, and I started to see more social unrest locally toward the end of my research, and I write about that in one of the final chapter before the epilogue. And you're right, but I do think that we need to consider these, maybe they're more philosophical questions about what makes a good community. How do we look out for one another? How do we demand more from those who may have, again, more money than they're ever going to know what to do with? Meanwhile, state budgets are going to be have been slashed, going to be slashed even more with the decline of fossil fuels.
That's right.
And I'm not an economist, so I don't pretend to be one in the book. But this is a tax haven, and I know that that's, everyone sort of knows that. It's well advertised. And if you do impose some sort of tax, and I don't know how that would flesh out, I would leave that to the economic experts. But it's not going to make people leave. We know that from research.
Right.
And 2, there's this emphasis on philanthropy, I think, because it's wanting to avoid the elephant in the room. That is, what if that they're going to give money, they're going to support programs, they're going to do that. Well, we do have a way in the US to do that. We have mechanisms, it's called taxing. And
Exactly.
And the other thing, to kind of go back to the point about what is a Wyomingite and what, all that, and the suspicion of outsiders, it is really interesting to me, just looking at the state and the culture of the state and the state's perception of Teton County. People come to Teton County from all sorts of places, but most of them, it's like East Coast, maybe Texas and California, and they're coming to enjoy and to essentially, I think, extract financial gain from the state, who has had this lucrative, oil and gas reserve set aside, and it's been very good at times. And so there's still this allergy toward taxing people that I think most Wyomingites are not friendly toward, and that's how, that's always been the reputation of Teton County. So it is interesting to me, this sort of cultural dynamic going on as well. But no, I at the end of the book, I try to provide some solutions, and one of those is, drawing on other research and knowing that some sort of tax could really help ease the pain that the state will be going through. And the other thing was, the ultra wealthy really do have an attachment to that area. It's not just money. And so I do think that they do many genuinely do care about that community. And there are many great people I interviewed that I keep in touch with and all of that. And for some, I don't think that they would even mind being, taxed. And so I would say that as well, just from my interviews with them and talking with them, even, keeping in touch with some of them.
Yeah. Another, I'm going to start to read comments and questions now, but another super huge part of Wyoming's culture, to my observation, is like a skepticism of people who come here and don't return anything.
Exactly. And that's exactly what's happening. Exactly. It's really interesting.
Yeah. The tax structure gives enormous benefits to people who come here to shelter wealth, and it asks for nothing.
I mean, even the how residency is defined is very loose. So some people, I would ask them how long they've lived here, how much time they spend, and they're very evasive about it, because for some, I know for a fact that a handful of people were there for like a couple of weeks in the summer, and maybe a week in the winter, and claim residency.
We have many questions and comments.
All right. Do my best.
And I'll just try to take them more or less in the order that I saw. A couple of comments, questions.
I'll try to be brief.
Oh my gosh. It's such a good conversation. We'll have to. One person writes, I've always thought of Grand Teton National Park as an urban park. The park was put together by Rockefeller in a way that would apply to Rockefeller Center as much as Wyoming. So the kind of valuation on land is familiar, the way that the rich set themselves apart, the way that the view and the look are commodified. This would make your book into a kind of epitome study of the way that land, money, time, and leisure are commodified in the culture. And this person says that they are thinking about David Harvey's work in this.
Yeah, I think, is that, do they have a question, or is that just my thoughts?
There's a second part to it.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So they write, apropos of your discussion of plutocracy, the dynamic that you present seems similar to what goes on in Wyoming in general, the way that the rich hide in plain sight, the way that being just folks plays out in political discourse, the way that selective philanthropy functions in a purposefully austere public funding environment. Did these comparisons figure into your study, even in terms of the kind of background that you have as a Wyomingite?
Wow, that person should have written one of the chapters. Yeah, I would just say, I completely. And linking it to, Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family. And, there's a lot of work on elites in New York, of course, on philanthropy in New York. And this was kind of taking a lot of that work and applying it in this natural setting. But what's really interesting to me, and kind of drawing on that question, trying to respond to it, would be that all this is kind of overlaid with this environmental altruism, this conservation ethic. And I teach it in environment school, and I'm all for conservation, but it allowed some of these things to kind of, I think, happen in a way that they were unquestioned. And even I've received pushback from the environmental community and some of my students who are at the environment school, just that I'm taking an overly cynical view of their environmental ethic, which I don't know, but I think that it is true that sort of has this unquestioned kind of nature to it, and even the ultra wealthy would buy into this ethic. One guy I interviewed, he rents a helicopter and flies around the Rocky Mountain West looking for land to preserve, and it's all in good faith, and he wants to preserve it and put it under easement. But that's his view of environmentalism, and it's viewed as this kind of unquestioned good, without recognizing some of the other aspects that this question raises.
Yeah. Super important to many people's hearts is the protection of public land. And maybe one part of the easement process is that it takes what is nominally public land and makes it not public land any longer. It restricts access to it. A comment that I think you'll find particularly rich, and I don't see a question here, but I'm sure you'd be able to respond to it. One person writes, I'm fascinated by this discussion so far. Me too, by the way. I'm fascinated by this discussion so far. It's early to weigh in, but I hear Justin helping us grasp the concept of systemic income inequality, just as we are learning as a nation, God willing, about systemic racism. It is so important. My relationship with Wyoming is complex by way of my own 50 years here, but my husband's family is 180 years here.
Yeah, and I would add that, we tend to think of income inequality and wealth concentration in that as an urban phenomenon, but it impacts millions of people in rural areas. And that was one of my main issues, and one of my main, I would say, goals rather, was to show how this is woven all through society. It's woven through the environmental movement. It's woven, through upper class culture, and its impact is almost everywhere. And that is kind of that person is right. And that was kind of one of my the main thrust really, is to show how this drama unfolds in a real life context with real life people and a real life community, just to kind of show it, in that way, and to unpack it.
Again, we have many questions, and I invite more, of course. But one person writes, what do you think of Kanye's entrance into Cody and his pouring of funds into the community? Cody has for a long time had a few wealthy residents, this person puts it in quote, few wealthy residents. This appears to be different. He is the talk of the town.
Yeah, I get asked about that quite a bit, and Ted Turner. I haven't interviewed Kanye, so I don't know, what he's thinking, and I don't want to get into his head too much. That would be very difficult. But I do see that some of his actions there kind of reflecting what I write about in the book, and coming in feeling like you're going to, make this huge impact, or coming in and thinking that no one's lived here before, or that, this sort of Western motifs or something that you can adapt and appropriate and make use of, maybe for your own political gain or financial gain. But also maybe he's just coming to Wyoming to get away. There is open space.
As we talked about in our conversation the other day, one of the things that people say these days is to say the quiet part out loud, and your book says some of the quiet parts out loud. So here is one of these kind of questions from one of our attendees. What is your read of the relationships, let's call it integration or lack thereof, between the wealthy in Teton County and our good old boy class, which appears to run the state at a legislative level and a business level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I do know that some of the ultra wealthy people I interviewed are active in state politics, and I mean even the last governor race, but I would say a lot of folks were more unaware of what was even going on in the state. There were obviously power players, and there are, that live in Teton County that are very wealthy and that give money and that, run for office and all that. But I would highlight that I would say probably the majority are just somewhat unaware, maybe don't even know, for example, something that, we all would take for granted about the role of the fossil fuel industry and the importance of that for the economy, are unaware of that, even something like so basic. They're mostly unaware of the working poor in the community, that, upwards 30% are Hispanic, that they come from, one village in Mexico, many of them, and just sort of understanding the basic contours of the community. And so when it comes to Wyoming, they're just kind of clueless for the most part. That's not to say they're involved in politics, wherever they lived before too. But many just want to come and enjoy and not worry about like the real world, and not worry about get too involved in politics. And that's part of the issue with philanthropy in the area, was that they don't want to get involved in that. And which was really interesting to me, and detrimental to people in the community, of course. So when it comes to state politics, I think it's mostly hands off, other than some notable examples.
Indeed, notable examples.
But that's plutocracy, because, you know, a handful of people can exert massive amounts of influence. And one thing I was going to add too is we're seeing here in Colorado, in Gunnison County, there's a second homeowners association just formed, a PAC, to influence local elections. And it's folks in Texas were upset that they couldn't come to their second homes. So they're forming an organization to influence the local election in Gunnison County. I haven't seen that in Teton County, but I could see that happening if they don't feel like their voice is being heard, even though they don't live there per se.
Our next person writes, I seriously question your use of the word generous. How do you define this word? Indeed, philanthropy and the presence of the wealthy on boards is important and valuable, but generous?
Yeah, touche. I think that's a good point. And this is where I would be critiqued for, I think, letting them speak for themselves or giving them the benefit of the doubt. And if you do read the book, I think you'll see it is quite critical, but I will have quotes in there about, you know, activities that they're doing that are, you know, philanthropic and that they do feel like they're generous from their perspective. I think objectively, they're not sacrificing much. And, you know, I highlight the amount of money given. This is in the chapter, I think it's the second or third chapter. The amount of money given relative to how much wealth is in the area, and it's minuscule, and it's much less than average amounts of giving that maybe a middle-class American would you know, give out in terms of the relative to their income. And so I think you're right that it objectively probably isn't very generous.
I have the paragraph.
Generosity would be supporting some sort of you know, annual tax that would come out of their pocket regularly.
Yeah. I have the paragraph here to which I think you refer, if you would like me to read it. Sure. The one about average club member household donations.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is from page 61 of the Billionaire Wilderness book. Several local nonprofit executive directors I interviewed were overtly critical of the foundation. This is the Yellowstone Club Foundation, an exclusive club up near the park. Critical of the foundation for patting itself on the back for giving what they viewed was relatively little money. They often pointed out that the club foundation donates only slightly more than the equivalent of just one member's initiation fee and annual dues, which is approximately $441,500. Or viewed from another angle, the average club member household donates about $571 annually to the community, despite the billions owned by many of its members and the billions the club has sold in real estate. Yeah, so, I mean, in my view, this is like the value of having good information and comparing it to the myths that we hear. Yep,
exactly. And the thing with this book, it's on a hot button topic, but, you know, I don't have to do a lot. I could just say that and in a way that I do think is a balance, but just accurate. And I think it speaks for itself. And just in the same way, some of the quotes I have, you know, that I don't have to say much. I don't have to explain it. It's more show, don't tell, as they say.
More show, don't tell. Indeed. The next person writes, my experience in Southeast Wyoming is that this narrative of the state being tremendously philanthropic is pervasive. But data show that the state is actually among the lowest in terms of per capita giving. You build a solid case for leveraging social capital through philanthropy by the ultra-wealthy, but can you talk at all about what maybe drives this pervasive perception among various socioeconomic strata? And this person writes, feel free to refute this perception. They're only a fifth generation Wyomingite.
Yeah, I didn't know. I wouldn't have thought that about Southeast, that it was pervasive across the state. I was unaware of that. And I don't know, I don't have a theory off the top of my head for that, but in terms of the ultra wealthy, I think it has to do with feeling like they're part of this small town community. And if you lived in Manhattan and then you move, and then maybe that's what Kanye West is doing, I don't know, but you move to a place like Teton County, you feel like you, one, can make an impact, and maybe a big impact, and then two, that it's also the social currency of the area, that the elite circles sort of function and around philanthropy, that there are events, there are I would go to dinners at people's homes, there, all these sorts of things, and the social circles kind of, that's almost like the oil that greases the social circles at the very top, and the philanthropy. And that's nothing new. We see that in other contexts as well, in urban areas too. So I think it was a combination of the social function, and then also intersecting with these myths about small town character and community, and the wealthy are gonna, like, this paternalistic type relationship where they're taking care of the people who need it.
Yeah.
But that's not the case, obviously.
So we are nearing the hour mark. I have one more question in my queue. I'll invite people to type more if they wish, but then probably we'll move to a close pretty quick. This person writes, Wyoming will not be able to rely on energy extraction in the future. The state budget is short $2.1 billion at least, with no desire to raise revenue. We will not be able to rely on the kindness of strangers or federal largesse. How do we get the ultra-rich actually to invest in an area that is essentially a theme park to them? Of course, the theme park aspect of Jackson is purposeful. That look was created in the 1920s.
I think that's a question that the state government needs to take up. And I think that we don't rely on folks who, millionaire migrants who just came maybe a couple years ago, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, to take that on and to be responsible for that. I think that that's something that you legislate. And again, as I said earlier, I'm not an economist. I don't know what the best way to do that, whether it be, taxing people who have, make over $1 million or $200,000 or, had moved there in the last year. You can do all sorts of things. But I would say that, I wish the state would reconsider, at least for this group of folks, the very, very top, who are enjoying at greater degree because they have more money, they save more money, based on the not having a personal income tax or corporate tax, all these ways that they're able to save money, and that those things would be looked at, under a harsher light, or even, I wouldn't say harsher light, just a better light, and I think a more a just light, and so that the state could live up to its moniker as the equality state, right? It is the equality state, and so and to enhance the common good and to ensure a brighter future for all residents requires action at the state level, and I think that again wouldn't push everyone out of Teton County, all the wealthy people out of Teton County, but it would really help people across the state and those in Teton County, the middle class and the working poor who do struggle. And I think, as as the question notes, will continue to struggle. I have, family in the state, and you see the impacts and you can see it coming. And so I think that's one revenue stream that, it could be very easy, and it's sort of, sitting there. And that's I hope I can start that conversation, but, again, I'm not an economist in terms of the nuts and bolts, how that would work, but.
Yeah. 3 more questions popped up. How about I take those 3 and then we bring it to.
Great.
In the interviews, was there ever discussion of philanthropy from Teton County to areas outside of Teton County, like the rest of Wyoming, or to the U.S. or the world?
It's a great question. One that I have never gotten that question. Yes. So this actually was from my first book, which some wealthy residents helped fund a conservation effort. I think it was in Sublette County. And then many people in Teton County are philanthropically active everywhere, not just in Teton County. And so that's just, whether it's in their home state. And so I would say yes, for sure. But in terms of documenting the patterns, I'm not entirely clear where they're giving their money. There are some who are politically active and give money to presidential candidates. There's one person in Teton County who's basically funded a presidential candidate before. But other than, again, those notable examples, I would say just kind of probably giving to different causes in their communities back where they came from.
A person writes, your conclusion proposes ways in which the ultra-rich can be made members of a community like Jackson or Wyoming in general. What is the role of the public humanities in this? More than giving rich people the opportunity for psychic healing or another connection to the mythic West?
What is the role of humanities?
There's a hometown crowd here, so of course you're going to get...
No, that's a great question. I mean, I would say for them, it would be unpacking the myths that they're kind of taking for granted, and not to sort of spoil their entire experience just for the sake of it, but to sort of reorient. And maybe that's what this question is referring to in the epilogue. I do make the case, there is this desire to connect to something in the state. And okay, what if we just take that desire, but then redirect it in a more positive and actually a way that corresponds with reality, and to take that energy and sort of say, okay, I appreciate the sort of enthusiasm and all of that, but here are the real needs. Actually, here are the real meanings of these myths that we have about the cowboy state, or that, all of that, and to kind of redirect it in a more positive way. But that's not going to change overnight. That's more of a cultural shift that, again, the public humanities, that's what they're in business of doing, right? And so I think that's where the value is.
And maybe one more.
All right.
Could you talk about what you learned from the working poor?
Oh, I have 2 full chapters on that. A lot. The first chapter, it really surprised me in some of my interviews. I would ask about their relationship with the ultra wealthy. For example, if they were a caretaker in a home and they worked for a family, they would some of them would speak very highly of the ultra wealthy. So it wasn't this, again, simplistic story where it's like, these people are taking advantage of me, they're treating me terribly. It was, I wish they paid me a little bit more so I didn't have to have this second job. Or I wish maybe the organization that I go to for Spanish or English language training had a few more people employed so I could go more often. There's all these sorts of things that relate to the inequality that is happening there. But I was surprised that there wasn't this deep animosity that you would expect, right? And then in the second chapter on the working poor, I talk more about how they've had more time to kind of get on their feet after immigrating and learn more about some of the causes of income inequality, some of what's going on, and what I lay out earlier in the book, and starting to organize and creating a movement, really. And so it was pretty inspiring. And for that, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about wealthy people flocking to Jackson, and we saw this kind of around the West and up in the Northeast as well, flocking to these islands to just hide out. Meanwhile, endangering, people who live there. At the time, it was very scary and about what would happen. Nobody really knew what was going on. And so I did some interviews with, folks who work at the airport, folks who are still having to provide services for the ultra wealthy, who are just fearing that they're going to get sick, their kids are going to get sick, all because people just feel like they can come here and use it when it's convenient for them. And so there I saw kind of just, in the last few months, more animosity building up. But you didn't see a huge spike in Teton County. And so some of what people feared didn't come to pass. But it was just sort of the attitude that you can kind of go back to the tax thing too. It's like, you can come here and extract what you want from this place, which is this kind of foreign place that you can come to. It's not a real place with real people. And I can kind of take what I want, whether that is hiding out during a pandemic, or whether that is, you know, avoiding paying taxes so you can make even more money.
Well, Justin, thank you for writing this book. It's a tremendous piece of work. I really, really enjoyed reading it, and I very much enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, me too. Thanks for having me. It's I really enjoy your work, all that you're doing. Keep it up. I love following it and watching all the podcast, listening to all the podcasts and everything. And yeah, I'll be doing more and more work. So maybe we'll meet again on Wyoming.
Great.
So
I look forward to it. And thank you everyone for joining us. Join us back here in 2 weeks.
great. Thanks everybody. All right.